Hello, everyone. My name is Michael Tremante, and I'm a product manager for the web application firewall at Cloudflare. And today I'd like to talk through a few points on how to ensure that you're launching the most secure website. We're going to go over several topics today, and I've stacked them, and I won't be going too deep into each one, but I'm hoping that by the end of this presentation, you're going to have a good idea on a checklist of things you can do to really improve the security of your web application, especially if this is a new app that you're launching. To begin with, I'd like to talk about securing DNS. As a first step of reaching any application, DNS needs to be up and online so that people can reach your application. To kick off the DNS topic, I'd like to actually refer to a quote from Tim Berners-Lee. As many of you know, Tim Berners-Lee is the inventor of the World Wide Web, and he actually said that TCP and DNS were the two fundamental ideas that essentially make the World Wide Web today. Surprisingly though, and I've been working in the DNS security infrastructure at Cloudflare for quite some time now, DNS is often one of those parts of any web application that gets often forgotten and overlooked when thinking about security, as it's sometimes given for granted. So what can you do to secure your DNS and to make sure that your application is indeed not hacked into by something that is not necessarily related to the application itself? Well, first of all, as you all know, we all have domain names that will point to our applications, but sometimes I'd ensure that the registrar you're using to register your domain name is indeed safe and it's a reputable registrar. Many applications have in fact been hacked over time, and I have an example here on the slide with Lenovo and Google, because the registrar was not safe. And someone was able to hack into the registrar infrastructure or potentially to the account that you're using to register your domain names and take over either ownership or the DNS configuration of that specific domain name, then causing, of course, your application to be no longer reachable from your end users. And even worse, if an attacker has access to your domain registrar, they could actually redirect your end users to a malicious application, perform phishing, deliver malware, or any other sorts of attacks. So step number one, for sure, make sure you're using a reputable registrar. And if you are, many times registrars do offer additional security around the account where you have registered your domain names. So please go and check, for example, that you've enabled two-factor authentication, if that is the feature that's made available. Another common mistake we see when talking about securing DNS is making sure that your entire DNS portfolio, so all of your domain names, are well tracked and located under potentially the same registrar. So it's easy to manage and to see that everything is in good order. Many times, many applications, because of migrations or because of acquisitions, you end up with several domain names. And if these are spread over different registrars, it's very easy to forget one of them and potentially let a domain expire, which, by the way, even this has happened to Google sometime in the past, causing then, of course, disruption for your end users and all sorts of problems. Another really good feature that domain registrars do allow, specifically for example, .com domains, is the ability to turn on a registrar lock. If you look at the slide at the bottom half, there's an example against my personal domain name, which is codelocker.com, is where my blog is hosted, but basically shows how to check if the registrar lock is enabled for your domain. If the registrar lock is enabled, you make sure that basically no one can transfer the domain to someone else without an additional check performed by the registrar, therefore increasing the security of your DNS. Now, we've talked about the registration and the security of where you register your domain names, but the DNS service itself is also very important to secure. If the underlying DNS service for your domain name is not up and running, of course, no one will be able to access your domain as they type the domain name in the browser. And nowadays, there's really no excuse to not have a well-distributed DNS service available online. DNS services are somewhat commoditized. So even for free, you can have very, very good DNS service, which is propagated globally and is actually sufficiently robust to even support things like DDoS, distributed denial of service attacks to your DNS infrastructure. Another actual point I'd like to bring up, DNS being one of the first protocols that got widely adopted for the World Wide Web, as we saw earlier with a quote from Tim, it was actually not designed with security in mind. And the DNS protocol itself can actually be spoofed quite easily as it is a plain text protocol. However, nowadays we have improved the DNS protocol with things like DNSSEC, which is a way to ensure that customers are actually receiving the correct DNS responses from your DNS server and that those responses are not spoofed. If you do have a .com domain name, and actually many other registries support this as well, please do go and check if you can turn on DNSSEC, as it really highly increases the security of your service, ensuring that your end users reach your application and not another spoofed application. Last slide about DNS. Of course, all of these tools are actually quite easily available. You can really quickly check the security of your domain with many tools available online. This is a screenshot of me looking at my own personal domain again. You can see that I have DNSSEC enabled. I also have another feature which many people enable nowadays, which is Whois Privacy, to, of course, secure my personal details. But the big one, for sure, if you have one point you can take away from the DNS security is go enable DNS security, and of course, make sure that your registrar account is safe and with a reputable registrar. With that, I want to move on to the second point, which is reducing load, which is another way to make sure that your application is secure and actually is able to withstand more malicious traffic than it would otherwise would. First point about reducing load. This is extremely important if it's a new application. The keyword I'll use here is cache, cache, cache. If you're setting up a new website, especially, for example, if it's a WordPress website, not all of its content will be dynamic, of course. Many parts of the page can in fact be separated from the dynamic content and be cached at the edge with a CDN network or some similar technology, maybe even on your server, so that any request that reaches your application, for the most part, does not require additional processing on your application. So the one thing I'd say, it's actually quite easy to separate your dynamic from your static content. Of course, the simple things such as images and JavaScript and CSS files, I'm hoping most applications will do out of the box. Applications like WordPress as well will immediately start caching some of those static assets, but you can very easily bring that a step further by separating even the layout of the HTML page from the static components to the dynamic components. I always make a very simple example here. If you have an e-commerce application and the only thing that's changing on the page is the shopping cart on the top right, most of the layout of the page itself, there's no reason why it doesn't get served from cache. Implementing the caching strategy is quite simple. You can do this directly from your application server, of course, and you can also let the browser cache some of that content. Below the slide here, I provide a curl example, which is a standard request to my website, that basically shows that actually, in my case, the entire page is delivered from cache. Various technologies will use different headers. In my case, you can see the CF cache status header has a value of hit, which means that my entire application is delivered from the CDN. The other good thing about serving from cache, though, is that if someone were to try to perform an attack to my application, most of that traffic won't reach my application in the first place, therefore securing even further the safety of my app whilst also making it faster. If you are reviewing your caching settings, it's also a very good time to look at some of the other common headers that can be used to improve security, but I'm going to touch on some of these later further down in the presentation. If you are implementing a caching strategy, a really nice thing to do at the same time is to build some monitoring and reporting against cached assets. This, ideally, like in the slide I'm showing here, would give you an overview of the amount of traffic that's hitting your application directly, and will actually highlight endpoints which you haven't secured sufficiently. And those are the endpoints that, of course, you need to pay the most attention for. In my case, I'm using a CDN technology to implement my caching strategy. It doesn't have to be complex. You can see here an example rule matching all traffic to my domain, star.codelocket.com/star. And for any request that comes in, I'm asking the browser to cache the content for 4 hours. And I'm also asking the CDN layer to cache all of the content coming out of my website. And the CDN will automatically refresh the cache, in my case, every 30 minutes. Of course, my blog is a simple application, but the same concepts apply to more sophisticated apps. Number 3, I want to talk a little bit about encrypting traffic. HTTPS is a technology that is easily adopted nowadays. So there is really no reason why, if you are launching a new application or a new website, you wouldn't have HTTPS enabled for your application. As many people know, HTTPS helps the traffic, helps no one be affected by a man-in-the-middle attack, so that the traffic from your client, the browser, or the end users is not compromised when it's going towards a server. Deploying an SSL certificate becomes very easy, especially now with some of the CDN technologies available, which will automatically provision and deploy SSL certificates for you and ensure that they are renewed well in time before their expiry date. You may also, of course, issue a certificate directly and go and purchase one from a certificate authority, but sometimes actually nowadays this becomes more complicated rather than offloading SSL TLS to the edge. If you are using an edge CDN or similar proxy service though, please do ensure that the connection between the browser and the edge is encrypted, of course, but also that the connection between the edge and the origin server is also encrypted. As sometimes I find, especially myself working for a CDN company, that is often forgotten, and there's a plain text component of the connection, which of course increases the risk of a man-in-the-middle attack. Another really nice thing you can do actually is enable a header which we call HSTS, which basically ensures that the browser will always connect to your application over an encrypted layer. So there's no risk that anyone would ever submit any information to your application without the connection being encrypted. So there's no risk of usernames or passwords being compromised. In the slide here, I'm showing the HSTS header applied to my personal website. And you can see that in this case, the header is indeed available, and I'm actually including all of the subdomains under my website. So if the browser connects to codelocker.com, all of those connections from that moment onward will be enforced to be encrypted by the browser directly. As I said earlier, there's no reason to manage your own certificates anymore. Indeed, this is also what I'm doing. If you're not aware, there's a lot of certificate authorities now that also provide certificates for free. One example for, that is very common in use is Let's Encrypt, which allows you also to basically regenerate very short-lived certificate directly on your server without having to worry about any purchasing or expiry dates. In my case, I decide not to do that. It's just completely offloaded. I do have, of course, the connection encrypted between the edge and my origin server, but this becomes sort of a problem with PAS nowadays, luckily, and I just let the edge network handle HTTPS connections on my behalf. Checking your SSL setup is also a really good thing to do before launching a new application, or even if you have an existing application. I would call out here the Qualys SSL Labs tool. Many of you may already be familiar with this tool. If you just head over to the website, you can input your domain name, and it will give you a report on the quality of your HTTPS or SSL TLS implementation. This checks for all sorts of things. It will also do a scan on the underlying IP addresses, but it will also check that the protocols you're using are all at the latest available, so that there's no risk of vulnerabilities if you were to be using older protocols. If I've managed to get an A on my personal website, I'm sure that, you know, especially for a production environment, it should be possible to receive an A, or in fact an A+. This is not the highest score that Qualys will provide to highly secured websites. Number 4, I want to talk a little bit about detecting automated traffic. Before I jump into detecting automated traffic, I wanted to show this slide because some people often, well, many of us often don't realize that actually a lot of the traffic happening on the World Wide Web is no longer human. In fact, this is a statistic coming from my own employer, Cloudflare. We monitor worldwide traffic all the time. We've got a very large edge network. And according to our own statistics, actually 41% of traffic we observe is automated. So actually a good chunk of any traffic hitting any website is not generated by a browser or manually generated by a human trying to access your application. With that in mind, it becomes ever so important to think about how to block and manage automated traffic, especially because not only from a security perspective, this can cause a very high resource consumption on your servers. And even more difficult than detecting automated traffic, a lot of the traffic generated from bots is from non-verified bots. I'm defining verified bots here as good bots. For example, your Google bot, which will be crawling your website to index it, or similar search services such as Bing from Microsoft or Yandex, or other maybe friendly bots that are well known and well recognized in the World Wide Web. Those bots actually account for a very small percentage. If you look at this graph, the green tip is our verified bots, whilst the purple bars at the bottom is actually the amount of automated traffic which is not coming from verified bots. So there are quite a few things you can do quite easily to make sure that your application is safe from this large amount of traffic which is likely automated and even more likely not wanted. First of all, you do not want to block the bad things, the good things. And you can do this by, for example, implementing very easy access control lists that are published by the bot owners themselves. So Google in this case, but Bing and all other large organizations do actually publish the IP addresses from which their bots will be connecting to your application. So please go ahead, download those lists and implement simple checks on your application that could say something like, for any request coming from the Google IP range, if the user agent is Google and the list matches what I've been provided, then do let the bot get through. But otherwise, you can already start blocking a lot of bots that fake themselves as legitimate Google or Bing bots. The other thing to note is these bots, especially non-verified bots, will be trying to do a lot of malicious activities on your site. In the worst cases, they will be trying to do credential stuffing attacks. Very often, unfortunately, nowadays, large databases with breach credentials are often shared among hacker groups, and they will then try and access your application by iterating over every username and password pair they have access to. Other bots will, on the other hand, try to steal, for example, your pricing data, or try, in the worst case, even to try and basically lock all of your stock if you're an e-commerce application, so that other users cannot purchase whatever products you are trying to sell. In the worst cases, I wanted to call out this example as I find it very interesting. If you search on Google for sneaker bots, there's a very large amount of effort going from hackers and programmers at large, which are trying to build very sophisticated bots, which are able to purchase shoes from websites that are selling sneakers as soon as they become available. We personally at Cloudflare, we try and monitor this activity over time. And we find that actually some of these bots very cleverly implement behavior that normal human beings would when accessing these websites. And of course, this does become very difficult to block without a proper bot mitigation solution in place. So if you were to ever get hit by these sophisticated bots, unfortunately for this one, I don't have an easy tip that you can implement in a couple of minutes on your application. But I did want to show this as an example of what you can do in the event this does become a problem. This matches a rule that I've implemented again on my edge network, which basically leverages a bot mitigation solution to detect even the more sophisticated attacks. The rules themselves can still be very simple. In this case, if you look at the slide, you can see I'm basically matching all of the traffic that is hitting my checkout endpoint, identified by /checkout*. I'm excluding from my filtering the verified bots, such as my Googles, my Yandexes, my Bings, etc. But I do want to block anything that seems to be a bot, and this is identified by a bot score of 10 or less. The resulting rule can be displayed below, and in many cases, it's impossible to have zero false positive rates with things like bot mitigation. So in my case, I'm actually not blocking the traffic outright, but rather I'm issuing a CAPTCHA challenge. If you're not familiar with CAPTCHA challenges, I do advise implementing a CAPTCHA challenge solution, especially in the crucial parts of your website, as they do tend to be more effective at blocking out bots, even if the more sophisticated bots will easily bypass CAPTCHA challenges. And nowadays, we've also observed things like CAPTCHA farms, where in some countries where cost of labor is very low, there's actually large rooms full of people manually solving CAPTCHA challenges on behalf of bots, which will then go off and perform the rest of the automated procedure. With bots out of the way, I want to talk about patching vulnerabilities. And I think this is very specific as well for WordPress applications. So WordPress, as we all know, it's a great content management system. It is incredibly popular. Most websites out there built on the World Wide Web are built on top of WordPress, but its fame sort of causes a lot of problems to come with it. Specifically, of course, it's a very good target for hackers to look for vulnerabilities in WordPress applications, because if they do find a vulnerability, they can then target all of the other WordPress available online and get access to a much larger pool of compromised applications. This is just a screenshot from the security category archive on WordPress.org. And you can see that over time, even the WordPress core team is releasing security updates to patch potential vulnerabilities that have been found in prior versions of WordPress. And, you know, some people often come to me and ask, you know, how likely am I to be targeted by a scanner looking for a WordPress vulnerability or similar that is just browsing the web? Well, the answer is it's actually very likely. This is a chart, again, generated by Cloudflare, where we actually had to look at the frequency of scanning tools out there, trying to check for compromised, or, you know, not compromised necessarily, but WordPress installations and other which have old versions and may be affected by vulnerabilities. And we see all sorts of attacks and scanning tools crawling the World Wide Web all, you know, on a daily basis, all the way from SQL injection attacks to XSS attacks, including actual vulnerabilities which are specific, for example, to WordPress plugins or other components of the WordPress platform. With that in mind, if you are launching a new application, and this of course is generic, not only to WordPress, please deploy a web application firewall. There are many free options out there. If you're not familiar with, for example, OWASP, please head over to the OWASP website and look at their OWASP mod security rule set. OWASP is an organization that basically provides a security advice. They're famous for their OWASP top 10 on how to secure web applications, but they also provide a set of rules that you can basically download for free. It's an open source project and implement on your application. The rule set itself is designed for Apache. So if you're running the Apache web server, you can simply import it and use it as is. But of course, it is applicable to many other technologies out there, and it will provide you with a really good layer of protection against all sorts of attacks, including but not limited to the more general XSS and SQL injection attacks. The one thing I'll say, though, is that implementing a web application firewall or one of these rule sets is not a one-time effort. It is very easy to do so, but make sure you set yourself a reminder to update your rules, not necessarily on a weekly basis, but at least a couple of times a month or maybe a couple of times a quarter. The rule sets, both the OWASP rule sets and vulnerabilities, get found on a daily basis, and therefore it is really important that you don't forget to update your protections. Of course, a WAF is only a stopgap. We call this a virtual patch. If a vulnerability discovered, the real fix, of course, is updating your application, updating your plugins, etc., so that even if the WAF were to not work anymore, or if someone were to find a bypass of the WAF, your application is still secured regardless. Number 6, okay, so we have a WAF in place now. However, there's some components of any application, normally admin areas or backend administrative areas, that can deserve and very easily be made a lot more secure by implementing very simple rules. And this actually I found to be a very effective way to keep at bay a large number of attacks. I've managed many applications in the past, ranging from WordPress to Joomla to Magento and many others. And I find that securing the admin paths and the administrative areas with very aggressive rules actually has helped me over time make sure that applications do not get compromised. Talking about WordPress specifically, of course, as many of you know, the login path for WordPress is under WP admin, and any path under that is considered part of the administrative area. I would suggest that you consider a rule, for example, that basically allows you and only you from a specific IP range or with a specific token to access the admin area unless anyone else needs to access it. Implementing these very simple rules will, number one, help you block out outright a large number of scanners. And number two, you could also implement an alerting system if you don't want to just block out anyone else from the admin areas, so that you get notified whenever a new connection is made, for example, to your administrative area. This is an example that I have implemented in the past. Of course, I'm using dummy fields here, but just to show you the concepts in practice. As a rule can be as simple as matching any request, which is trying to access a path under WP admin. You can be more specific as necessary. In my case, this was sufficient. And then basically checking the IP address of the incoming connection. Of course, if you do implement a rule like this, ensure you have a backdoor. You don't want to be risking, locking yourself out from your own application. But if something like this in place really helps a lot, make sure that only you and only you, of course, can access the more sensitive parts of the app. Number 7. Okay, so we've locked down our application. We have a WAF in place. However, a lot of attacks still happen outside of the scope of our application. Specifically, they happen directly in the browser. So I want to talk about mage car attacks very briefly, specifically named supply chain attacks. This is a new attack vector that's been happening over the last couple of years, and a number of very large companies have already been affected. And I'm showing here 3 examples. There's British Airways, Ticketmaster, and Twilio. All 3 very large companies with really good technology teams. However, they have been compromised by a supply chain attack, whereby an asset loaded by the browser, such as a JavaScript file, was actually compromised in a third-party application and not directly in the application owned by these companies. We call this a supply chain attack. Unlikely, any application out there, including your own, is loading third-party assets, and the security of those is just as important as the security of your application. And actually, this is very timely. I prepared this slide deck just for the Decode event, and whilst I was preparing this slide deck, I was doing some research, and it just happened that very recently a supply chain attack was very successful and actually compromised a large number of big applications. And you can read at the bottom here: Microsoft, Apple, PayPal, Shopify, etc. All due to a third-party, library being loaded in those apps, which was not secured properly, and not necessarily a compromise in the applications themselves. So, how do you defend yourself against third-party supply chain attacks? Check your dependencies. If you are loading JavaScript libraries, you're loading JavaScript plugins, a plugin for a gallery asset, for example. If you can, there's no reason why you wouldn't load those assets from your application directly, especially nowadays with the CDN. Don't refer to third-party links. Download those libraries, host them yourself, cache them in the CDN, and that already increases the security of your application substantially. Secondly, there's technologies in place that actually help browsers validate that those assets have not been compromised. The typical example here is SRI hashes. And they are very simple to generate. I'm providing, if you just search for SRI hashes, I've linked in the slide, but you can basically find many tools online that allow you to paste in the URL of your asset and will generate a hash, which will be sent to your browser, and the browser will validate that that asset hasn't changed. Of course, ensuring that the browser is loading all the good code and no malicious code. Another tool that is very easy to implement here is CSP reporting. This is another thing that you can enable on your application just by adding a header that goes to the browser, but basically tells the browser to alert an endpoint that you specify in the event something is not looking right or some other assets is being loaded by the browser. With that, I finished today's presentation. I hope you enjoyed the various topics we covered, and it will help you prepare and build more secure applications that you might be launching online. Thank you very much.